Science communication at universities is changing. And if you're a researcher in academia, you're going to want to listen to why this is important to you and how you can get more of your research out on the university channels, hopefully. That's if you have good communication skills and you're ready to spend more time on science communication. That's what we're going to talk about on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And you know, it's really funny when we talk about science communication, because that's going to be our focus today, and you look at the way communication is done today. You know, social media channels is huge. PR, like big media sites, you know, CNN, CBC, MSNBC, all those big conglomerate communication TV channels and so forth and digital channels are huge right now. And to be able to be part of an institute or of a larger sort of conglomerate that can actually get eyeballs on your research is great. Because, you know, I remember when I was a kid, every once in a while on the news or somewhere within, within the larger landscape of TV, you would see an odd show or a program or a segment on a TV show on a news channel where they had research that was really interesting to people. And the journalists decided to cover it, and it got airtime, or it got in the newspaper. And so people would listen to, I remember my parents would read the newspaper. My mom still does, and she will, send me articles on, she'll cut out the newspaper article and send it to me if it's on something related to marine biology or the ocean. And I love that. I think that's a great way to be able to get people interested in the ocean, interested in sort of the media that goes on. However, we all know that media is very, it's kind of for the few. It's very rare to see an ocean article get in a Canadian newspaper, for instance, or an Ontario newspaper, or an Ontario-focused newspaper, because we know newspapers change their front pages depending on the region of which they're serving, because they want it to, that front page has to sort of be important to the people who are reading, and usually the more local, the better, right? Because it's more pertinent to you. I get that. That makes sense. And when we talk about getting in front of those TV networks and the channels and the newspapers and so forth to get a broader view of whatever the topic is, whether it be on science communication or science research or just on regular news that's happening in and around you at that moment, you have to have the people that could get access to there. And not every individual can get access in there. I don't have access to the Toronto Star or the National Post or, the big newspapers that are here, or the CBC, or, a lot of different places. But other channels who are known as news channels can get access to some of those areas because they've networked within that, that industry, and they have more connections within that area, so they can get in there a little easier. They have those back-end connections. They have that network to be like, hey, I think this might be an interesting story based on that conversation we had, the other day when we were having dinner, or when we were at that event that had to do with journalists and things like that, right? I'm just making this up as I go along, but the deal. Like, for me as a marine biologist, I have a lot of insights on what projects are coming in and what news is coming out based on people that I know who are working on this stuff, or who are part of the organizations who are working on specific research that might be interesting to you. And they come to me and they say, hey, Andrew, I have a story for you. And they're like, can I come on the podcast and talk about it? And I'm always like, yeah, for sure, because I trust them, because I know who they are, I know what work they do, and I know that if they've come on before, or we've talked about them coming on before, they pretty much have open access to me, and we'll be like, yeah, let's start a show. I put out three shows a week, so there's definitely room for new research and new projects that need to be communicated to you guys, to my audience, right? That's what I love to do. But I'm also very careful of what subjects get out there. I think I've only been wrong on a few of having people on that really didn't benefit you overall. But I'm very careful of that, because I want to protect the information that you have, because you trust me on bringing in really good information. Well, that's the same way it works, I assume, in the journalistic world. where, you have networks, you have people who are trusted, you have sources who are trusted that come and bring, hey, this could be the next big story. You might want to put this on, or this could be a really good story for you based on the conversation that we had, as I mentioned earlier. And so when we have this type of connections, we get access to these areas. And basically, universities have those types of connections, right? They have central PR offices or central communications offices for the entire university. And that university has the ability to disseminate any information that is generated by the members of the university, whether that be from a political standpoint, from a research standpoint, from a science standpoint, from an economic standpoint. Universities are pretty much, for the most part, they have a lot of different subject matters that they cover. They have experts in a variety of different in those subject matters. And so when research is provided or somebody makes big news, the university wants to promote that, because what are the universities promoting? They're promoting good stuff happens here. You should send your kids here so that they can have that good stuff, right? That's essentially, it's like good education. We have great experts who are making news. We are popular. Bring us your kids, which brings us your money, and then we can continue to educate and we continue to push the envelope in innovation and all that kind of stuff, right? Now, that's always great. Imagine if you're a researcher from a communication standpoint, from like my perspective, if I had all these, this following and these channels to get, research out there in front of some pretty big audiences, not just the podcast audience, but other audiences, or say this audience even grows to a point where it's like, wow, this is huge. I can do a lot more with this, and I can get to much bigger platforms, and I can get research out more. More people will want to come to me to have that access. So researchers like in science, in economics, in social science, all these different types, fine arts, whatever, they will want access to the university press office, right? They want access to that communications office because they'll have a bigger channel. They have a wide net, which funders and granting agencies can see, so that they can get more funding for them, as well as have a name for themselves, so that when they do apply for grants and funding, they will have a bigger name for themselves. The funders will be like, oh, this is actually kind of good. Let's maybe fund this because this person was in the news and they're willing to communicate with the public. But it's hard to get access because the universities can only put out so much. And there's a new study that I was following just the other day. Actually, Samantha Andrews on LinkedIn shared this with me. Sam is an amazing ocean storyteller. She's a science communication. She's a psychology person. She's a researcher, very brilliant. And we've known each other for a number of years now. And she posted this article. It's a peer-reviewed article on PLS01, right? Plus one, I guess it's called. But it's an open access, so I'm going to put the link in the show notes. It talks about how communication has evolved at universities from central offices. So the title is University Central Offices Are Moving Away from Doing Towards Facilitating Science Communication. From doing towards facilitating. So from doing towards facilitating science communication, a European cross comparison. Now, this is in Europe, and I can almost be pretty confident that this coverage, or this way, this evolution has happened here in North America as well. Just based on, obviously not my own personal experience, but just based on what I've seen from other people. So what used to happen with this article, I'm going to summarize the article, but again, I highly recommend that you read this article because it goes into a lot more detail. But what used to happen was the central office would go out and look for information. So they'd have their connections within the university, specific researchers, and knowing what they wanted to market. Because if you think about what a university is doing, I kind of mentioned it earlier before, a university wants to promote the science and research that's coming out of that university, right? And it could be in any topic. It doesn't have to be a scientific topic. It could be any kind of topic that they have, any kind of department that they have. And so when they have something to share, they will share it. So they used to go out and they used to look for information, and they used to ask for information, and then they would write it up themselves, and then they would check with the researcher, and they would say, is this correct? Yes, that's correct. Okay, great. We're going to put it out. And they would do it based on the evolution of, the channels. They would do it through, public relations, a PR standpoint. They would do it in forms of in-person engagements, speeches and so forth. And that would be great. And they'd be more local to where the university is situated, or where that department is situated, because universities can be in different cities as well. multiple cities, I should say, each university. So that looks like what that's way it's going. And then there's also the digital channels, the podcasts and the YouTube videos and the social media posts like Instagram and maybe even TikTok. Not sure about TikTok, but Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all those things, right? So they always want to put out information because the more information they have, the more they can promote their work. And again, they're trying to attract people. They're trying to attract kids that will come to their school and learn from them, and also attract different funders and granting agencies to put more eyeballs on there and say, hey, this university is really good within this department, or they have some pretty interesting research within the science or biology department or the chemistry department or the physics department or the finance or fine arts department, economics, business, some computer science and all that kind of stuff. And so they get more eyeballs on there because you have lots of communication channels that the university, the central offices, the communication offices of the university, that goes out and talks to all the different media, and whether it be traditional media, whether it be digital media, they have all that access, right? So that's always great. Now that form has changed over time. It's evolved, and I don't know what is the reason for that evolution, but it's something that you should know about if you're in academia and you want to get your published paper out or information on your published paper. And, this is something where instead of the Central Communications Office having an idea of what the research is going on, maybe it's because there's more researchers, it seems like now they're looking at facilitating the information that goes on. So instead of, being in regular conversation with all the different researchers and typing it up themselves and writing up the copy and stuff, now what they do is they depend on the researchers to say, hey, I've got this really cool paper that's coming out, or I got this new funding and this new project starting off, and I want the university to put it out on their channel. So what they do is they actually have, like, the researcher has to type up everything. They have to almost say, here's a case of why you should be putting this out there. This is why it's important to the university. This is why it's important to the research. And so the onus is on the person who's doing the research. The onus is on the person who wants the information to get out there to go to the central office. This is not something that's necessarily new. It seems like this is the first paper in a peer-reviewed journal that's actually doing this type of work, or that's actually looking at this type of work in Europe. I don't know if this has been done in North America. The paper says it seems like this is the first paper that's really looked at this and published on this, but I'm sure people have looked at it before. But I've heard a lot of different workshops in science communication for academics where this is pretty much how things work in North America, in the US anyway, and maybe even in Canada, is that if you have something of interest, you have to type it up and make a case for the Central Communication Office to be like, hey, you know what? This is actually a really good paper. I think you should publish it on your channels, and maybe send it to the different, publishers that you have, whether it be, in Canada, it would be CBC or any of the different channels that you can do, whether it be, traditional media or digital media and stuff like that. Podcasting. I get pitched 2-3 times a day with different types of projects. Not always ocean related, not always environment related. Some of them are really off the mark, but there are many that I take, because it's information I never would have had before. And it's because I've been growing an audience to say, hey, you know what, we talk about this kind of stuff, and I have an audience that really wants to hear about this kind of stuff. And so I build relationships with different communications people for different organizations to be like, hey, if you ever have anything else, please, send it to me. I'd love to cover it. And I think that's a really important aspect. That's why I get a lot of the information, a lot of the interviews that I do, is because, people are sending it to me all the time. And I like that. That's a lot of fun for me. It makes me seem like I'm doing something good and I'm actually bringing you information that, maybe other people aren't bringing out, or not everybody's picking up. So it's important to me. But from an academic point of view, from a PhD, from a postdoc, from a master's student, this is a great way to learn how to work with the university sort of central communications office, and to say, don't just wait to get picked up. You have to put the effort into building a science communication sort of method or process to get your central university to be able to do that type of publishing. Now, with that said, they're only going to take stuff that they want to publish on. Universities are notorious for promoting stuff that makes them look good or that maybe fits what they want to be able to do, right? What they want to be able to promote. And unfortunately, with conservation, it's not always top of mind, right? Just like politics, conservation is not always top of mind. A lot of times biotechnology for the sciences gets picked up a lot more because the universities love when researchers create something, create a product or create some kind of intellectual property, some kind of IP that they can sell, that they can turn around and monetize because it brings in more money. They're not necessarily worried about conservation practices. They're not necessarily worried, unless it's like groundbreaking. They're not necessarily interested in, why a specific whale or a specific dolphin or a specific something is, not getting, is going extinct or something like that. They're not necessarily worried about that. They're not, unless you're part of an MPA or a marine protected area that is massive and is like the biggest ever, they're not really concerned with that. If you come up with something innovative like a product that they can monetize and get a piece off of, well, now they're interested. So there's a little bit of a problem with that. And in this article, they talk about the different levels of reach of communication. So with the communications office, you are going to get that high level communication. So it's going to be a brief production of what you've done, an overview of what you've done. It's not going to go into the nitty gritty. It's probably going to be one post. It's probably not going to be huge. It may or may not get to traditional media, depending if it fits within what this university wants, what this academic setting wants, but it's not always perfect. Then you have different levels. You have departmental levels, right? So your department, say, of biological sciences or biology, they may want to say, hey, this is actually really cool. We want to be able to publish this. So they have their own channels, which could have a pretty good reach on where they want it to go. They may have this reach where it's like, oh, yes, if we can have it reach out to a different department or somebody that we know or a grantor that's funded our department for a while, they'll be interested in this kind of stuff, and they might be interested in funding later on, right? You got to remember what the focus is of the departments to bring in more money, bring in more eyeballs to look at this information and bring in more students as well to be like, hey, we're on the cutting edge of this type of research. So they may like that a little bit more specific to science. And then you have the lab level, right? If you're a professor and you have a laboratory or you're within a laboratory, there's that lab level communications, right? Which is almost like a local level communications where you're doing it more on an individual base, right? It's a lab base and you can do it from a lab perspective. And then that can oftentimes compete or complement an individual level, depending on how far that lab has gotten in science communication and how big their follower count is on social media and how big their connection levels are with places that do documentaries like Animal Planet or Discovery or even like local news channels or national news channels. Some labs have more connections than others because they've put more work and more time into science communication, which I love to see. But if they haven't, sometimes the individual can have a bigger following than the actual lab. And so that individual can use those channels, their channels, to be able to share their research as well as their labs if they prefer, or their friends and stuff like that, which I think is really good. So there's always, ways to communicate, but you can communicate with more detail at the lower level, right? When it gets more local, when it gets to individual based, lab based, then department based, and then university based is more of an overview. And I think, people need to realize that. I think to expect your universities, your central communications office at university to be able to cover everything is probably not that great. But you can, on the local level, you can point to the attention it's gotten on the university level, and then lab level, local level, department level, you can play around with that and see what really hits big with that audience, because it'll be a different audience. With a university-wide audience, you may not get all the audience that are interested in science updates. But with the Department of Biological Department of Biology or Science, you're getting people who are interested more in science. They might be more interested in your article, so you can go into a little bit more detail, maybe use some of that jargon that we love to use so much. And then on an individual basis, like family and friends, right? And the colleagues, like other lab mates and stuff, that see what you're working on. And I think it could be important. It could work really well for your career when you publish like that. However, depending on the university and depending where you're applying and depending what you're saying online, it may go against your career when you're looking at academic settings. So be very careful with the way you communicate. But if you're communicating your project and your science in a professional manner, even on your individual level, on your sort of your personal profiles, then you're looking at getting some attention and more eyeballs on what you're doing. And we're in an attention economy. I'll tell you that right now. And so to be able to have that attention economies or attention on you is going to be really important for your career, especially if it's in a positive manner. Has to be in a positive manner, else it's not going to work out for you. But that's essentially what I want to talk about today is the different levels of communication within a university, and also talking about how the changes, what the evolution has looked like with universities from going to a central sort of that sort of, maybe even you can say gatekeeps at times, but looks at what they want to be able to publish on and promote, to almost democratizing it a little bit and putting the onus on the researcher who wants to get their science communication work out there, right? Their science out there for that communication. So the onus is put on them to make the effort to put it there. And the incentive is get more attention, and the incentive is get more, which will hopefully lead to more grant and more foundation money. And as well as attracting different students, the top students that you want to attract, the best students who have eyeballs on you, that will be able to give you the best work possible when they're doing graduate work or even undergraduate work, right? So that's sort of what I want to talk about today. I know it's not the exciting news that we've been talking about before, but it's something that I feel is very important to us, right? We're at a point right now where conservation is about communication. That's Sir David Attenborough said that. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's something that we need to focus on, is this communication. And so for those of you who are following a degree in marine biology or marine conservation and listening to this podcast and you listen to this podcast on a weekly basis, well, this is something for you. This is the one for you to really take up and give it your mission. You may not have the career incentive to do it. You may not get like direct incentives, but you might get some indirect love from this in various ways. I know I have since I started my podcast, but it's a tough road. It's a lot of work, but I think it's worthwhile. If you're really in it for the ocean, the communication aspect is really important. It's critical. And so understanding what the levels are and how far you can get within a university and what your options are, I think is extremely important as well. Just make sure, caveat, if you're a graduate student of any sort or an undergraduate student, you're working in a lab for a professor, make sure you get permission from that professor, from the head of that lab, that you're allowed to publish the work on there. I know some people who've gotten in trouble over the past. Open communication is important, and understanding what the lab manager or lab lead or the PI wants on their project, you have to abide by. If they don't want you publishing on it on social media, then you don't publish on it. If they want you to, that's even better. That's great, so you can publish on it. But get approval from them, even if you have to do it on a per post basis until they gain your trust on this. Because some professors don't really have a full understanding of the benefits of publishing on social media or publishing on media channels and through the central university. So it's good. You'll have to have that conversation with your lab manager or your PI. So that's it for today's episode. I want to thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. If you want to get a hold of me, you can do so. If you have any questions or comments on this episode, get a hold of me through Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. And if you could do me a big favor, a huge favor, I'm asking this in every episode now for a little bit. Can you leave, if you like this podcast, can you leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, or if your app that you're listening to this episode on allows you to do so, can you leave a rating and review? The reason is, it's not that I want to hear that you love the podcast. I like hearing that, obviously, and reading that, but I want other people to know why they should listen to this podcast. That's really the question that I want you to answer in that. Why somebody should pick up, like if they're searching this podcast or searching on oceans and they come across this podcast, why should they be listening to this podcast? That's the benefit. That's how we grow. If you have a friend or a family member who wants to learn more about the ocean and you think this is a good podcast for them, please feel free to share. We're trying to grow sort of like organically, sort of through reference, through referrals, and that helps with you guys. I really appreciate you listening each and every episode and providing comments and engaging with me to give me feedback and so forth on how we're doing and what the information is like. So I'd always love to hear from you at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram, and of course, leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast app. And thank you again for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time. I'm Andrew Lewin, your host, of course, and have a great day. I'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.